So a little bit ago, I found this little segment of Voyager season 5 that I'm not as familiar with as I am with the rest of Voyager, which made them kind of fun to rewatch because I haven't like practically memorized them already. I guess they were just some episodes that we didn't happen to have on VHS back when I was a 10 to 12-year-old. So instead of me having them practically memorized, I've actually only seen them a handful of times, probably two, possibly three times, and none of those times were when I was 10 or 11. So anyway, last week I went and started walking through some of those, and I watched two of them, Gravity and Bliss, pretty close to back. Gravity was the one where Tuvok and Tom are trapped on the desert planet with Nas, uh, the girl alien who has feelings for Tuvok, and they have eat spiders and all that. And we get this really cool flashback of young Tuvok with the Vulcan Master, and the Vulcan Master is working with him to help him learn how to control his romantic infatuations. So it's an interesting episode, getting us a little bit of a window into Vulcan ways of thinking about emotions and stuff. Bliss is the episode with the telepathic picture plant, the big space alien floating in space that Voyager thinks it's a wormhole because it's trying to convince them it is, and they think it's going to take them home. So they're all telepathically fooled by the alien, as well as triggered in terms of brain chemicals and stuff. They're triggered to be less careful by higher dopamine levels and stuff like that. And then the only people who aren't affected are Seven, the Doctor, and Naomi Wildman. So they fly into the mouth of the monster, and you can see the monster's guts on the outside. See it through the windows. They're inside the beast. Everybody goes unconscious except for the unaffected people. And then, of course, Seven of Nine manages to save the day. And there's also this really cool alien who's been hunting the creature, and he's kind of epic and cool with his rickety old ship that's been through 1,000 nightmares and back. It's kind of like he's hunting the great whale, that kind of thing. I think the creature killed all of his friends and family back in the day or something, and he's been hunting it for years and years. So anyway, two pretty cool episodes, and it's so fun for me to get to see. Basically, for all practical purposes, it's kind of like I'm watching new Voyager in the sense that it's kind of fresh for me, but at the exact same time, it still feels like that very warm, fuzzy, familiar Voyager because, of course, that's what it is. It's the same old Voyager. It's just I didn't happen to, have them back in the day. It was intriguing watching the flashback scenes with young Tuvok. I guess mostly this time around, because I would have seen it back in 2018 or so, whenever it was when I watched through them on Amazon Prime. And then possibly I might have seen it when I was a teenager, but then if so, then I completely forgot about it. So basically I've seen it twice, possibly three times. But anyway, so this time around watching Gravity, watching those flashback scenes with young Tuvok, I guess I was kind of playfully analyzing the Vulcan Master's approach rather than focusing quite as much on Tuvok like I did last time. That was more of my attention last time. A lot of the things that the Vulcan Master said were actually decently reasonable things to think about, such as observing your emotions, being aware of the directions your emotions can go with you, what they possibly come from, what they relate to. Also, the very practical observation that he made that the object of Tuvok's infatuation doesn't reciprocate, so in a way, it's really not a question of Vulcan heritage versus love pitted against each other, which is kind of how I was thinking of it last time. But it's actually a little more like it's a matter of coping skills versus unstable behavior. That's what's being pitted against each other. It's a very reasonable dilemma that Tuvok is in. He's experiencing this tension because of this thing that he can't have. I was especially intrigued this time around by the line of reasoning that the Vulcan Master suggested, in which he pointed out to Tuvok how much madness, and that whole concept of madness is also going to come out later in adult Tuvok's conversation with Tom, when he talks about falling in love or infatuation. He refers to it as madness, and Tom basically says, well, that's kind of par for the course, get on the boat. But anyway, the Vulcan Master, the line of reasoning in which the Vulcan Master pointed out how much madness Tuvok's feelings could lead him to, or would lead him to. I think this line of reasoning began after he made the suggestion that the girl, he made the suggestion of the possibility. He says, you know what, I've I have reason to believe that this girl is actually in love with one of your classmates, and then afterwards he points out all the disastrous things that would happen inside Tuvok's mind based on that suggestion. This is where Tuvok, he makes that suggestion, and then Tuvok kind of starts mentally spinning out of control, and he's talking about, oh, who is this kid? I want to challenge him or something like that, And so this whole conversation about madness, it kind of stood out to me as I was thinking about how the mature Tuvok, the adult Tuvok, as a married person, he kind of lives out a different kind of love. Because adult Tuvok is heavily motivated by his feelings for T'Pel. I'm pretty sure that's her name. I'm not completely. It's funny how all the Vulcan females have to be T'P something. T'Pel, T'Pal, T'Pau. Sometimes I just get them all mixed up. But I think Tuvok's wife is named T'Pel. But he's heavily motivated by his feelings for T'Pel, as evidenced especially in this episode that I just saw almost back to back. This episode, Bliss, in which the telepathic picture plant is actually able to manipulate Tuvok by telepathically elevating his chemical responses, particularly in regard to his feelings for T'Pel. So Tuvok may not call it love, but the fact is that he loses his objectivity when he has an opportunity to see her. However, I think the situation in Bliss would be actually, to Tuvok, would be the exception that proves the rule, in the sense that Tuvok would deny that such a thing could conceivably happen, because Tuvok isn't supposed to love T'Pel or have any kind of response beyond loyalty, approval, respect, compatibility, friendship, and perhaps in the most extrinsic sense, some kind of shared bonding, but certainly nothing like love, devotion, longing, passion, belonging, let alone being consumed with or consumed by one another. So the incidents in Bliss would be, for Tuvok, not a disproving of the standpoint, but actually the demonstration of it. When his perspective on T'Pel becomes less logical and more romantic, it's kind of like he lost some of his logical wholeness as a Vulcan and was made vulnerable to the advances of manipulation and uncontrolled behavior. Or to use his favorite insult for people like Neelix, it made him erratic, So anyway, back to the discussions on gravity. It seems that the Vulcan philosophy that the Vulcan master was encouraging Tuvok toward wasn't to undervalue marriage, but to undervalue romantic love, and particularly the passionate kind. And what made me find that more intriguing this time around than last time I watched it was that it reminded me so much of some of the comments in the final chapters of Dorothy Tenov's original work on limerence from the 70s, which I read a couple years back. As she came toward the end of her book, talking about the agonies and ecstasies of the infatuation/honeymoon phenomenon that she calls limerence, and which is popularly associated with the language of falling in love. She points out that a significant number of the individuals that she interviewed for her book had come to the conclusion that love, in this particular sense, was actually something to be avoided. These people concluded that the only way they could make a relationship work was if they specifically chose somebody who they didn't have passionate romantic feelings for in the limerent sense. As these people saw it, the agonies of limerence, the madness of limerence, and particularly the agonies of limerence, weren't worth the kind of payoff that might be in view. Far better, as these people see it, far better to turn and run far away from somebody the moment you sense you may be becoming limerent and you may lose yourself in her or lose yourself in him. And by a similar token, she also described throughout the book that there is an even more significant portion of the population that has never experienced limerence at all. And these people would write it off as either the poetic exaggerations of shallow people who are just way too emotional, and just exaggerating things, or as just the behavior of people who are just generically out of control in general. So people who fit that category, they may end up happily married, but their definitions of romantic love or passion would be much more, shall we say, sensible, a little more Vulcan in that sense. So between these two classes of people in real life, we have a very real phenomenon of happy and stable, you could say, mere friendship marriages or relationships, as well as, of course, mixed, quote unquote, mixed marriages in which one member may be familiar with limerence and or passion and the other may not be, or vice versa. But for Vulcans, this is the ideal. not the mixed one, of course, but the pure old sensible match of two logic birds, not love birds, but logic birds. And I suppose we've all, whether we know it or not, we've all met Vulcans walking around here on Earth with their ears shaved down, or maybe they're the normal ones and everybody else is under telepathic alien influence to make them go mad. Well, who knows? But when people like that, the logic birds, as it were, when they see people who are, as Tuvok would say it, erratic, they're just baffled because they were never that silly when they met their significant other. And they had plenty of disappointments and surprises and whatever else these silly people claim made them lose their minds. I mean, excuses. These people just need to meditate once daily and they'll realize their lives are completely wonderful, But Tuvok isn't one of those people. Tuvok knows what it means to lose your center because of an experience that consumes you completely in a completely out of proportion way to the seeming reasonableness of the thing that's doing it to you. He knows what that's like. He's a little more like the limerent person who ends a relationship or a prospective relationship the moment he or she suspects that this person might be just that special. Because that kind of vulnerability or erraticness, certainly no, madness, that kind of thing is just not okay for Vulcans. Just like for a lot of humans who've experienced the worst that love has to offer, it's just not okay for them either. Another kind of small bit of overlap between the episodes Bliss and Gravity is the fact that the experience that the crew has under the influences of the picture plant is a good bit like limerence, generally speaking. Not just because a number of the crew had a significant other in view who they wanted to return to Earth for, such as Tuvok. Not just for that, not primarily for that, but even when that wasn't the case, the phenomenon that the crew was experiencing included an increase in certain brain chemicals, such as dopamine. It included an increased tendency to see the good things about the desired goal they were moving toward, and to have significant blind spots in regard to risks and things like that, and in regard to the significance of negative aspects that were going on. For example, the captain was certainly bothered by having to get rebellious 7 of 9 under control. What's wrong with 7? We're losing 7, She was bothered by that, but she really wasn't half as bothered as she ought to have been, as she normally would have been if she wasn't under this influence. She's not bothered because they're just about to get home. And whilst she's kind of experiencing a bit of madness in which nothing looks as big or shiny or wonderful or worthy of your attention as the one great object of your desire. Because in limerence, it's not that you aren't aware of, let's say, negative traits in your partner. Studies show that generally speaking, when people were interviewed, they could identify the negative traits, the same ones that later they would identify as being a little more significant. They saw them, they saw they were there, but it's the significance that's just completely out of scope because they're so consumed by the significance of all the desire and the positivity of the goal that they're moving toward, the excitement. I think the most visible image that caused me to make this correlation was the really sad moment when Voyager went into the mouth of the beast and everyone had these really big smiles on their face, like really big, way too big of a smile. And that's when it became clear that this really is a parallel psychological experience, even though, of course, this is a fictional experience, but I think based on real experiences, kind of like two giggling lovebirds walking into disaster together, completely oblivious to whatever misery awaits them. Or like kind of like the giddy person walking into the bedroom of a femme fatale who's been working on him for a couple of months and he's just head over heels, And this really, it's also worth saying in passing that this isn't sex drive. Sex drive has its own kind of power, but the falling in love experience is quite distinct, and I would suggest far more powerful in terms of its capacity to overwhelm the whole person, psychologically speaking, as well as, of course, on the other side of it, its power to empower a person to do seemingly impossible tasks, to step over seemingly impossible boundaries and all that in order to acquire the object of his desire. So it's not just a negative thing, it empowers people as well. But definitely not the same thing as sex drive or that kind of thing. You could say that there's a whole bunch of things that can and often do go together. You could say that limerence, sexual bonding with all the chemical aspects going on there, relational attachment, values or meaning-based commitment, and then other elements, add some more things to that. You say these are all parts to the whole, which when taken together, the amalgam of all these different things are kind of the formula that makes monogamous committed relationships to a certain degree instinctive, and certainly makes them a lot more realistic, and is part of what makes them happen when it seems like the odds were against that kind of thing happening. These things do and can all work together, but they're not one and the same, because they certainly can work separately as well as together. And there's definitely a distinction, an important distinction between each of them. So anyway, to get back to Gravity, I think there were two primary themes that stood out to me this last time watching it. And I actually suspect that these might even be the two primary themes, objectively speaking, though I'm certainly not ready to say that, since I've only seen the episode twice, possibly 3 times in my entire life. And for Voyager, for me, that's a very small number of watchings. But anyway, so these themes would be, on the one hand, Tuvok's background and his perspective on the importance of using coping skills and mental discipline to remain in control of any tendencies toward unhelpful romantic feelings. Or for Tuvok, you could be better to say any romantic feelings at all, because all romantic feelings are unhelpful as far as he's concerned. But then, so that, and then secondly, the question about how to relate to someone who isn't on the same page as you in that regard. First time I watched this, I thought the whole episode was about Tuvok not being honest with himself about his feelings for Nos. This time around, it seems to me, while that was certainly part of it, Tuvok is also being completely honest when he says that he's fine with the situation. I don't think he's exaggerating or lying at all when he says that he has no struggle in regard to having feelings for Nos, particularly because of his marriage to his wife, and also because, from his Vulcan point of view, having a relationship with someone such as Nos just isn't an option. And to go back to Tenov's book on limerence, one of the key ingredients that she listed that could lead up to the development of limerence in an individual was the subjective sense that the desired other was to some degree, at least conceivably, attainable. Even if the person wasn't actually attainable, part of the limerent experience was the fact that the person developing the feelings was continuing to think that it was possible. So in Tuvok's case, he's so committed to his wife and to Vulcan philosophy that Nos simply isn't an option to him. It's not even conceivable. He's able to notice his attraction to her and notice her attraction to him, at least, at a certain point. And he's able to accept both of these realities without either of these factors making such a relationship to be a live option for him. To put it another way, it seems like he doesn't find her tempting because his self-identity as a Vulcan, his moral commitments as a married Vulcan, his ideological commitment to Vulcan philosophy, all of these form a wall that couldn't even conceivably be pushed over as he subjectively sees it. And the point is, and what makes it important isn't how big are these barriers, but the point is, how does Tuvok see these barriers? Does Tuvok think that conceivably there could be a situation where he gets past them, or in Tuvok's mind, is it just completely ludicrous, not even on the table, not even on anybody's table? So there's that, but Tom isn't just trying to get Tuvok to admit that he likes her. That's definitely part of his goal as he confronts Tuvok. He thinks, for that part, he's thinking, how can anybody not be attracted to the only source of beauty in this whole barren wasteland filled with spiders and dust? And then how could there not be that attraction? How could that attraction not lead to infatuation and love and stuff like that as the months go by? So he thinks Tuvok ought to at least admit it. But when he finally can't get through to Tuvok on that front, then he moves on to the other very important point, which is, even if Tuvok actually doesn't have any of these feelings, but what about her? And that's particularly the question that he asks Tuvok so legitimately in that scene after Tuvok has already crudely rejected Nos, and he continues to feel nothing about it, not even compassion. And then I think this is the scene where Tom finds Tuvok meditating on the stone ledge, which is just such a cool looking. I love the visual setup for that scene. It's so kind of picturesque and iconic. It's it's tragic that Nas had to experience the kind of violent experience of rejection that she did, and the tragedy of violent psychological fallout from an unexpected rejection. It's always one that's a little kind of sad, trying to analyze, trying to, in some helpful manner, try to analyze it in terms of why it had to be so bad, and what could have been done differently so it wouldn't have been like that. I think in this particular case, it seems like the problem most likely really began with their communication in the months leading up to that point. Seems like the reason she experienced the rejection so violently was because there was a failure of nonverbal and implicit communication between them prior to that, in which she would express her affection. He would remain indifferent to it, at least as he saw it, as he intended to express himself. He's remaining indifferent to it while continuing to express friendship and to imply that his view of her was the same as her view of him. And so since she didn't know Tuvok before they met, and she knows he's just one of those emotionless and people who's kind of stoic about everything. So she really has no frame of reference, no reason not to interpret his behavior as, maybe for this guy, this is the strongest reciprocation that this emotionless guy knows how to give. And in that sense, the communication breakdown would have happened a long time ago. And it would have resulted from Tuvok's blindness to her social cues, because Tuvok, throughout his life, didn't see these kinds of social communication, this category of communication, as relevant to him. He just didn't see it as part of his world. And so he didn't have skills, he didn't develop skills to be able to identify or respond to this particular category of social cues. And since he continues to see this aspect of life as irrelevant to him, he also continues to ignore and or remain oblivious to such signals. Unfortunately, by ignoring them, he affirms her not just in her friendship, but also in her infatuation. And as such, she is shocked and torn apart when he rejects her, because up until that point, he unknowingly was communicating to her that he would not reject her. The other, and perhaps more significant, source of the tragedy of this violent rejection is, I think, sourced in Tuvok's emotional closed-mindedness, his own resistance to sufficiently acknowledging passionate emotions, and then the resultant ignorance that he has about the passionate emotions of others. And perhaps an even deeper root than this is his felt belief that, as per Vulcan philosophy, one ought not have such feelings. And it's the fault of the person having the feelings. His insensitive rejection, as well as his prior unintentional encouragement of her feelings without distinguishing friendship interest from romantic interest, that his insensitive rejection is the result of the fact that he sees feelings as something that should be there. Feelings of any kind, but especially these feelings. That's how he interacts with his own feelings, and that's how he interacts with hers. So he doesn't understand her on the one hand, since he hasn't had to deal with the real weight of romantic feelings since his childhood. And then on the other hand, he doesn't value her emotions or respect her vulnerability. The emotions that he sees in her are the madness that he experienced back when he was a child, and which he feels so ashamed of. That's what he sees in her, rather than seeing in her the healthy and right vulnerability that she has, as she's as a vulnerable offering that she's giving or offering to him, while making herself weak in so doing for his sake. So instead of seeing this picture, and instead of gently affirming her vulnerability as she makes herself weak for his sake, instead he's looking from this picture, and instead he, by implication, condemns her for being wrong. By way of contrast, later, after he's had those conversations with Tom, and he apparently realizes his insensitivity and psychological ignorance, then later on, his parting conversation with Nos near the end of the episode, there he instead that conversation contains implicit affirmation. One may suggest that Nos's openness in that final conversation is the result of, in between those two interactions, some positive and unambiguous but relationally positive interactions that she had with Tuvok in between those two scenes. And in this final conversation there in the transporter room, he allows her to share her feelings without shutting them down or insisting that they are invalid. And then when she says she wishes things could have been different, he simply admits, as do I, without budging from his Vulcan impassivity, on the subject. But he says that, thus affirming that her feelings are in fact reasonable, normal, and perhaps even in a limited way shared by him. In that short statement, he may have been implying that he shared some attraction toward her, and in a detached sort of way, he could see the appeal of having a romantic relationship with her and making that wasteland a little less of a wasteland. Or maybe he may simply be indicating that he wishes things had been different in the sense that he wishes that the shocking rejection and the hurt feelings hadn't happened, that he wishes he had noticed her social cues before that point and indicated to her the limitations of their relationship before she got to that point. But whatever the implications were behind those words for Tuvok, they acknowledged and affirmed the legitimacy of her experience and his continued respect for her as a person whom he cares about. In a sense, if the earlier confrontation involved Tuvok basically making the point that the simple fact is that you are wrong, if that's kind of what he was basically saying there, then in the same way, he is now making the main point, you are not wrong. That it wasn't wrong for Nos to think that Tuvok was interested. It wasn't wrong for Nos to think that someone like Tuvok could possibly like her back. It wasn't wrong for her to express her feelings to Tuvok, and especially that it wasn't wrong for her to have those feelings in the first place. So some of the things that I jotted down from earlier on as the Vulcan Master was talking with Tuvok. Vulcan training in this episode versus actual, for us humans, healthy emotional coping skills, because the Vulcan Master is it's not just about, love versus being a Vulcan. It's really about coping skills versus, being out of control with this girl who doesn't like you back, It's interesting how the Vulcan Master contains some elements of healthy dealing with emotions by talking about noticing your feelings, thinking about the ins and outs and some cognitive aspects. For example, to increase self-awareness to help you gain more control, rather than the stereotypical Vulcan image of just violently pushing down your feelings. Seems like, I thought to myself, it seems like there's a bit of a mix in terms of what kinds of methods the Vulcan Master is giving. Because you definitely get the feeling by observing Tuvok, adult Tuvok, he doesn't seem to have a lot of emotional awareness playing out beneath his controlled exterior. Versus, the Vulcan Master was encouraging him to explore and think about what's going on with these feelings rather than just shut them down. It's much more like the adult Tuvok has kind of shut down his feelings rather than that he allows them to be and notices them in a much more, what you might hear from a good therapist and gaining control that way. You also have the final moment when young Tuvok has finished his training. He's finally done. And then when he's done, it's like suddenly he switches and his face changes into this kind of impassive Tuvok-y kind of look on his face, which definitely indicates the result more of a repression kind of idea rather than increased awareness, which would be a more healthy approach. So if somebody finished emotion management training that was done well, one would think, if he's going to have someone snaps his finger and the look on his face changes, we would expect that look on the face to be maybe more of a Kes or Janeway kind of look that implies awareness, that kind of emotional awareness that you sometimes see from characters like Kessler Janeway. And you can see that visually, just like Tuvok has his own Tuvok face. There's also the Janeway compassion face, or the Kess kind of knowing face that she has, rather than this kind of glazed look that implies indifference. In contrast to that would be the kind of knowing look that implies awareness, which I think would be more appropriate for somebody who finished a healthy emotion management training program. So all that to say, it seems like there may be kind of a mix of ideas in that sense, but probably more leaning toward the unhealthy repression side. And then we just recognize within the Star Trek universe, we just recognize that Vulcans are kind of supernatural in that sense, in the sense that they're able to do this repression stuff, which in real life would be terribly unhealthy. But as Vulcans, with their supernatural telepathic power, whatever it is they've got, they're able to do that remarkably with as little mental health troubles as they have. Though, of course, some Vulcans, such as T'Pol, have quite serious mental health troubles. But ones like Tuvok, generally speaking, don't. Even Spock, for the most part. And you could also suggest, and I kind of added this after the fact, after I wrote down the other stuff, you could suggest that the part about noticing your emotions, when the Vulcan Master was going on that part, you could suggest that that was just him using rhetoric to ease Tuvok in toward a willingness to admit how dangerous these emotions are. He wasn't suggesting this is a healthy way to live with your whole self. He was instead just saying, hey, let's look at this and see how terrible it is. So that once he does that, then Tuvok can learn how to violently repress them and be unaware of them, because they are, you can deny them, live in denial, and you'll be healthier, that kind of thing, which as supernatural Vulcans is feasible. For humans, it's a really bad idea. Also, I forgot to mention the mind meld, and I added this into my extra notes afterwards. I forgot to mention the mind meld in that final scene with Tuvok and Nas in the transporter room. After everything else happens, he does a mind meld. I think that was a very important moment, and clearly, looking at her reactions, that helped her a lot, because then she actually understands. But I think even before that point, before he gave her the mind meld, Tuvok was already showing her, communicating with her more by being more emotionally sensitive. And I think that in a sense, the mind meld was kind of, it's not like we've got two separate things going on here, the emotional sensitivity and the mind meld. It's more like the mind meld was the end result of his new mindset of emotional sensitivity, where he chose to communicate with her the best way he could. And for him, because he's not good at this human romantic language stuff, the best way he can communicate as a Vulcan is to kind of expose himself, become vulnerable a little bit himself. And he did that through a mind meld. And that was impactful. And that allowed her to go off with positive feelings and really understanding him and herself, instead of continuing to be kind of broken through that negative experience. One other thing that I added on to the end here, it's really interesting to compare Gravity to the original series episode All Our Yesterdays, which is the one with the library where they go through time and there's all these different time areas. Same setup of they get lost in this wasteland and they find a beautiful girl and she falls in love with the Vulcan, except in that case it was Bones and Spock instead of Tuvok and Tom. The difference is that in that TOS episode, well, in the Voyager episode, it's a little more realistic because the girl doesn't have to be stunningly beautiful. In that TOS episode, it's like she's wearing this big old fur coat and you don't know what kind of creature she is, and then she pulls off her hood and it's this stunningly beautiful girl, But in this Voyager episode, she doesn't have to be stunningly beautiful, because if you do meet a random girl in a barren wasteland, then by odds, she's probably not going to be stunningly beautiful. But as with Nas, she becomes beautiful because she's the most beautiful thing in sight. And I think definitely, and one of the intentional parts of the setup with Gravity is just how barren and grotesque the environment is. You're eating spiders, there's dust everywhere, gritty ship interiors, etc. And also, of course, the other important difference is that the girl in All Our Yesterdays, she tries to use lies to get Spock to stay for her. So she kind of takes a path from seeming completely good, with no flaws, toward becoming more morally gray, though in certainly a very understandable way. Whereas Nos starts off being morally gray, though in a very understandable way, and becomes more completely good the more they get to know her, because Nos, when she was introduced, she's basically the scavenger trying to steal from the shuttle, threatening Tom, that kind of thing. Also, a little comment about the name. I think the name is interesting. Star Trek names are always so interesting. It was some kind of gravity related phenomenon that got them trapped there. So gravity, they're stuck because of gravity. But gravity is also an expression that I've heard in a variety of places, that I've heard people use to refer to the seemingly inevitable experiential phenomena that we experience, such as love or other emotional experiences that feel greater than your own self. So gravity, meaning they got stuck on this planet because this gravity thing got them stuck and they couldn't get out. But also gravity, the human experience, where you fall for somebody and your only options are either to face it or go mad. So I think that's kind of cool. There's often some kind of double meaning in a lot of these titles, which I find fascinating. So anyway, these two episodes, Gravity and Bliss, they were two very intriguing, fun episodes to watch. I love seeing some of these Voyager episodes that I'm less familiar with and getting to experience, almost like, not that this would have been the first time, but like it's fresh, like I've only seen it like once. And so new territories to think about and reflect on. And I also enjoyed, for these two particular episodes, I enjoyed reflecting on how the Vulcan approach to emotion is presented a little more clearly here than what we've seen in a lot of other parts of Star Trek. So yeah, good stuff. Catch you around.